The kettle had been whistling for nearly a minute before Harry noticed it. He was standing at the window of the Burrow's small upper landing, the one between his room and the ghoul's attic, where the wallpaper had bubbled away from the plaster in a long, lazy strip, watching the garden below. Fred's old gnome-throwing patch had gone to seed. The apple tree near the fence had dropped half its leaves overnight, and they lay scattered across the wet grass in a way that was either peaceful or melancholy, depending on the morning. This morning, Harry couldn't quite decide which. "Harry!" Ginny's voice came up from the kitchen, not sharp, just noting. "Kettle." "Yeah." He turned from the window and moved down the stairs, ducking automatically at the low beam on the fourth step, a habit he'd acquired sometime in the past 18 months, so smoothly now that he barely registered doing it. That, he thought, as he reached the kitchen and lifted the kettle from the hob, was perhaps the problem. He had stopped registering things at the Burrow. The low beam, the particular creak of the third stair, the way Molly always had a plate ready before you knew you were hungry. He had learned the Burrow the way you learned a language by immersion, not by study, but by repetition, by living inside it until it simply became the shape of things. He set the kettle down and poured 2 mugs. Ginny was at the table, reading. She had her legs folded under her in the chair the way she always did, the prophet open flat before her, though Harry suspected she wasn't actually reading it. Her eyes weren't moving. She had a habit, when she was thinking, of holding very still, as if thought required stillness, as if moving would disturb whatever was assembling itself inside her. "Molly's already gone to Diagon Alley," Harry said, setting her mug near her elbow. With George." She turned a page without reading it. He had some new thing to show the shop. Apparently involves something that turns into something else, which turns into something else, and then makes a noise. Sounds about right. Harry sat across from her. Outside, a garden gnome waddled out from beneath a hedge, looked around with the dim, resentful expression that all gnomes seem to carry permanently, and waddled back in. The morning was grey and cool, the kind that felt permanent, the kind that made summer seem implausible. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the kitchen. The hanging copper pots, the clock with its 9 hands, all presently pointing at home, the slight lean of the ceiling over the far corner that Arthur had been meaning to fix for as long as Harry had known about it. Familiar. All of it familiar in a way that should have felt like comfort and instead felt like something else, something he hadn't found the right word for yet. Ginny put the prophet down. She looked at him, not studying him, not with the careful attention that people had directed at Harry for most of his life, that particular gaze that was really about them, about what they hoped or feared he was feeling. This was different. Ginny looked at him the way you looked at something you were simply curious about. "You were at that window again," she said. "Was I?" "You do it most mornings, the landing window." She picked up her mug. "What are you looking at?" Harry considered. "The garden," he said. "The fence line, whether the charms on the boundary held overnight." Ginny was quiet for a moment. Then, "And did they?" "They always do." "Then why do you keep checking?" He didn't have an answer for that, or rather, he had too many, none of them simple. He looked down at his tea. It was still steaming. Outside, the gnome had emerged again and was now engaged in some private enterprise near the base of the fence, digging, apparently, with the focused energy of a creature who had decided this was the most important task in the world. "I don't know," he said, which was almost true. Ginny didn't press. That was one of the things about her. She had a remarkable ability to leave space around a conversation, to not fill silences immediately, the way some people did anxiously, as though silence itself were a problem to be solved. She drank her tea and looked at the garden too, and for a few minutes neither of them said anything. Then she said, "I want our own walls." She said it quietly, without particular emphasis, as though she were noting something she'd been turning over for a while and had simply now decided to say aloud. Not a demand, not even quite a request, more like a conclusion that had finally settled. Harry looked up. She met his eyes. "I mean it. Not, I love it here, you know I do. Mum and Dad are, this is home." She paused. "It's home, but it's my home, the one I grew up in. And I want—" She stopped again, and for a moment, something moved across her face. Something she was trying to get precise. "I want a home I chose. I want walls I chose. I want to decide where the table goes." Harry looked around the kitchen. The table had been in this precise spot, he was fairly certain, since before Ginny was born. The same corner, the same slight tilt toward the window. Generations of Weasley meals eaten at it. The wood worn soft along the edges from years of elbows and arguments and laughter and ordinary Tuesday evenings. He thought about the spare room he slept in, the one that had been Charlie's, that still had a faded poster of a Romanian longhorn on the inside of the wardrobe door that nobody had ever bothered to take down. He had unpacked his trunk eventually. His things were on the shelves, in the drawers. But he had never, not once, looked at that room and thought, "This is mine." "Okay," he said. Ginny tilted her head slightly. "Okay. Yeah." He looked back at her. "Let's find somewhere." Something shifted in her face, not surprise exactly, but relief, perhaps. The relief of having said the thing you'd been waiting to say and finding it received without damage. She nodded once and reached across the table and touched the back of his hand briefly, and then picked up the prophet again. The thing was, and Harry understood this, in the abstract, the way you understood a thing before you'd really reckoned with it, the Burrow was wonderful. It was genuinely, comprehensively wonderful. He had understood this the first time he'd arrived here, at 11 years old. Having stepped from a flue, he'd badly misjudged into a kitchen full of warmth and noise and the particular chaos of a large family in motion. He had stood there covered in ash and looked around and felt something he didn't have the vocabulary for then, something that only resolved itself into language later. This is what a house is supposed to feel like from the inside, because until then he had not known. Privet Drive had been clean, orderly, correct in all its external details. The furniture was polished, the lawn was trimmed, the net curtains were precisely hung. From the outside, from the street, say, on a summer evening, Number 4 Privet Drive would have appeared perfectly normal, perfectly acceptable, the sort of house that a reasonable person might look at and call home. Harry had not looked at it from the outside. From the inside, it had been a subtraction, the way certain things were managed so that Harry's presence was the minimum necessary. A room that was not a room, but a cupboard. A place at the table that was geometrically outside the warmth of the family. A name used by the Dursleys. in the way you might say the thing when referring to something you would rather not name directly. He hadn't thought about that in a while. Or rather, he had thought about it in the way you thought about things you decided were settled, closed off, filed away. It was over. The Dursleys were, well, they were somewhere. He didn't know where exactly, and he'd found that not knowing suited him fine. But standing in Charlie's room some evenings, looking at the Romanian Longhorn poster and the half-empty bookshelf and the small window that looked out over the garden, he found himself aware that he had never quite learned the grammar of belonging to a place. He knew the feeling. He had felt it here, at the Burrow. He had felt something like it at Hogwarts, in the way the castle had particular moods, particular corners that felt like they'd been waiting for him. But Hogwarts was not his, and the Burrow was Ginny's, was the Weasleys'. He needed, he thought, to learn something he should probably have learned before now. That evening, Arthur came home with a bag of Muggle objects he'd acquired from a colleague in the misuse of Muggle artifacts office, a collection of things that had been confiscated and were technically supposed to be destroyed, but which Arthur had, with a bureaucratic flexibility that Harry suspected had been refined over many years, managed to redirect via his desk. Now this, Arthur said, holding up what appeared to be a small chrome device with a number of buttons and a tiny screen, I believe is called a remote control for the television, though I can't quite work out which television. It's for a garage door, Ron said, looking at it. A garage door, even better. Arthur beamed. And this? Harry sat in the armchair by the fire and watched the family arrange itself around the table, Ron with his elbows on the wood, Hermione beside him with a book she was technically reading, while also participating in the conversation. Ginny at the far end, with one knee up, laughing at something George had said before George had quite finished saying it. Molly moving between the kitchen and the table in that efficient, endless way she had, producing things, tea, biscuits, a dishcloth, a plate of something, from what seemed like sheer intention rather than preparation. He watched them, and he felt the familiar warmth of it, and underneath the warmth, the equally familiar feeling that he was watching from somewhere slightly outside. Not excluded. He had never felt excluded here. The Weasleys were constitutionally incapable of that particular cruelty. But there was a difference, he thought, between being welcomed into a warmth and being the source of it, between sitting inside a light that someone else had lit and knowing how to light your own. Ginny caught his eye across the table. She didn't say anything. She just looked at him for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention, and in it was the echo of what she'd said that morning. I want walls, I chose. He thought, I don't know how to do that. And then, somewhere underneath, I want to learn. They looked at the first house listings that weekend, at the kitchen table with a cup of tea each and a copy of Witch Weekly's property supplement that Hermione had found in a pile of Molly's magazines, and passed along with a slightly cautious expression, as though she wasn't sure how it would land. It landed strangely. The photographs moved, of course. Small looping images of cottages and converted farmhouses, and a peculiar semi-detached in Dorset, whose garden appeared to be having a disagreement with itself. Harry looked at them and felt something he couldn't immediately name. Not excitement, not dread, something more uncertain than either. This one, Ginny said, pointing to a cottage in Devon. "It has a south-facing garden." "South-facing is good." She looked at him. "It means sun." "Right, yes." He looked at the photograph. The cottage was neat, whitewashed, with a low gate and a climbing rose that had been photographed in summer. It looked like the kind of house that appeared in stories, in illustrations, in the sort of book that was trying to tell you what England looked like from a comfortable distance. "It's near enough to the Burrow," Ginny said. "But not too near." "Exactly." Harry nodded slowly. He looked at the photograph again, the gate, the path, the door with its small iron knocker, and tried to imagine arriving at it, tried to imagine it being his. The exercise felt strange, like trying to remember the plot of a story you'd never actually read. "Shall we go look at it?" he said. Ginny smiled. Not the large, easy smile she used for most things, but the smaller one, the one that meant something had gone the right way, that something had landed where she'd hoped it would. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," Harry agreed. He looked back at the photograph. The cottage sat there in its small looping summer, peaceful and inanimate, and entirely unaware of being looked at. Through the garden gate, partly out of frame, a window caught the light. South-facing, he thought. Sun. He wasn't sure what he was looking for yet, but he thought perhaps that was all right, that learning what you were looking for was part of the looking. The estate agent's name was Patricia Holloway, and she had at the gate when they arrived. A woman at the gate when they arrived. A woman in her mid-50s, with neat silver hair and a yellow scarf that was doing considerable work against the grey of the morning. She had a folder tucked under one arm and a smile that appeared to have been arranged some time before they pulled up, held in place and ready. Harry noticed as they walked up the path that her shoes were impractical for the damp grass, but that she was bearing this without complaint. He appreciated the professionalism in a distant way. "Mr. and Mrs. Potter," she said, and the warmth in it was genuine enough that Harry didn't find himself minding the title. He was still getting used to it, not the marriage itself, which had been small and right, and Ginny's idea in terms of the garden ceremony, though Harry had chosen the date, but the way strangers used it, the Potters, as though they were already a thing, a complete thing, with edges and a shape. "The listing photos really don't do it justice," Patricia said, opening the gate with a small flourish. "The light in the afternoon is extraordinary. The previous owners used the front room as a studio, actually. A painter. You can still see the north window they had put in, though the south-facing ones are the real glory." Ginny made a small sound of interest and moved ahead slightly. Harry followed and looked at the cottage. It was, objectively, he supposed, charming. That was the word. Whitewashed stone, low and wide, with a tiled roof that had gone pleasantly uneven with age. The climbing rose from the listing photograph was bare now, just brown wiry stems across the left side of the facade. But you could see where it would be in summer, the whole front wall softened by it. The path from the gate to the front door was flagstone, slightly damp, edged with lavender that had gone grey and woody for the winter. It was the kind of house that looked like something. Harry stood at the gate a moment longer than necessary. "Shall we?" Patricia said, gesturing. "Sorry, yes." He moved up the path. The front door opened into a narrow hallway with coat hooks and flagstone continuing from outside. Patricia talked about the original features, the stone floors, the low ceilings with their exposed beams, the inglenook fireplace visible through the first doorway on the left. Her voice was pleasant and well-paced, the voice of someone who had shown a great many houses and knew which details landed. Harry was not listening to the details. He was counting the exits. It was not a decision. It was not something he chose to do, standing in the hallway of a Devon cottage on a Saturday morning with his wife and a cheerful estate agent. It happened the way breathing happened, the way ducking the low beam at the Burrow happened, automatically underneath thought, installed by years of operating in spaces where the question, "How do I get out of here?" was not abstract. Front door. 1. The hallway ran straight to a kitchen at the back. He could see the outline of a window above a sink, grey daylight. Back door, probably. 2. The sitting room on the left had a door to the garden. He could see the handle, an old brass lever type, through the inglenook room. 3. Stairs going up, windows upstairs. He'd have to check the drop, the angle, whether any of them were accessible from the roofline of the original sash windows throughout the upper floor, Patricia was saying. They've been restored rather than replaced, which is increasingly rare. The frames are solid. They open properly, Harry said. Oh yes, fully. Beautiful airflow in summer. Airflow. Yes. He filed this under, accessible from outside. Ginny was in the sitting room now, standing in the centre of it, her arms slightly out at her sides, the way she sometimes stood when she was trying to feel a space. He watched her turn slowly, looking up at the beams, then at the inglenook, then at the window. The window was large, south-facing, as advertised, and even on this grey morning, it was pulling in a soft, diffused light that moved the room from cold to something else. It's lovely, Ginny said, and meant it. Harry looked at the window. His first thought, which arrived before he could stop it, was large enough to see into from the lane if someone positioned themselves at the hedge line. He turned away and looked at the fireplace instead. Patricia took them through the rest of the ground floor with practiced ease. The kitchen, which had been updated at some point in the 90s, in a way that was functional, if not beautiful. A small utility room off the back. A dining room that was really an extension of the kitchen, open plan in a way that probably seemed spacious and might, in a different version of himself, have felt welcoming. Harry stood in the dining room and looked at the back garden through the glass doors. It was a good size, enclosed mostly, hedgerow on 3 sides, a low stone wall at the back with a wooden gate in it. Beyond the gate, a lane. Beyond the lane, open fields. Open fields. The gate at the back, Harry said. Where does the lane go? It connects to the B road, about half a mile north, Patricia said. Very quiet. The previous owners used to cycle it. There's a lovely route down to the village. Is it used much, the lane? Barely. A farm vehicle occasionally in harvest season, but otherwise, no. Very peaceful. Harry nodded. He was thinking about the sight line from the far field, whether a standard notice-me-not charm would hold at that distance, whether the hedgerow was dense enough year-round, or whether it thinned in winter. He looked at it now and could see light through the lower branches, a pale stripe of sky through the base of the hedge where the growth was sparse. He could fix that. Dense planting charm, accelerated growth, would take hold in 6 months if you layered it correctly. The lane itself was a variable, too open, really, for the approach from the north. Harry. He turned. Ginny was in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, leaning against the frame with her arms crossed and a look on her face that was not quite concern and not quite impatience. Somewhere in between, something that was watching him carefully. "What do you think so far?" she said. "It's nice," he said. "Solid construction. The stone is good." A beat. "The stone is good," she repeated, without inflection. "The bones are right," he said, aware as he said it that this was not quite the answer she was asking for. Patricia, who had the professional tactfulness to be very interested in a kitchen cabinet during this exchange, made a small sound of agreement about the bones and began talking about the boiler. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom, plus a smaller room at the end of the hall that had been used as a study. The master bedroom faced south, the same direction as the sitting room below, and had 2 sash windows that let in the best light Harry had seen all day. The ceiling was low and the room was not large, but it had a particular quality of enclosure that was different from smallness. It felt, he thought, like a room someone had thought about. Ginny stood at the windows and looked out over the front garden, over the rose canes and the lavender edge and the flagstone path and the gate. "You can see the whole front from here," she said, to no one in particular. She said it the way you'd say something nice. An observation she was storing. Harry looked at the same view and noted that you could also see the lane approach from the east and part of the road junction 50 meters to the left. He said nothing. The smaller room at the end of the hall, the study, had a single window facing north and a built-in bookshelf that ran the full length of one wall. The shelves were empty now, dusty in the way empty shelves got when a house had been unoccupied for a few months. Harry stood in the doorway and looked at them. He thought, for a moment, of Dumbledore's office. The shelves there had never been empty. Every surface had carried something. Instruments, books, the pensieve, the particular accumulation of a very long and very considered life. There had always been something to look at, something to wonder about. The office had felt, despite its tower position and its headmaster authority, oddly like a place someone lived in rather than occupied. He had never had a room with a bookshelf. He had had the cupboard, which had no shelves, the small bedroom at Privet Drive, which had a flat surface above the radiator that served the function without quite being one, the dormitory at Hogwarts, which had trunks and the particular shared disorder of 5 boys in a space, the room at the Burrow, which had Charlie's things, still quietly, persisting. He looked at the empty shelves and thought about what would go on them, and then stopped himself because the thought felt presumptuous, felt like moving too fast, like assuming an ending before you'd worked through the middle. "This could be a good study," Ginny said, appearing beside him. "Yeah. Or a nursery eventually." Harry looked at her. She was looking at the shelves with a slight smile, the private kind. Not saying it to him quite, just saying it into the room. He turned back to the shelves and didn't say anything, but something in his chest did something complicated and quiet. They stood in the front garden afterwards while Patricia locked up, and the morning had brightened marginally, the cloud cover thinning without quite resolving into actual sun, the light going from grey to something closer to silver. "It's beautiful," Ginny said, looking up at the front of the house. "It really is. The rose in summer must be..." "The back garden has a problem, Harry. Approaching from the field side, you'd have direct access before anyone inside would have time to—" "Harry." Her voice was gentle but particular, the voice she used when she was being precise. He stopped. "Who?" she said, carefully. "Do you think it's coming through that gate?" He opened his mouth and then closed it again. The question sat in the air between them with a patience that felt almost kind, not accusatory, just present, waiting to be answered. He looked at the gate. It was old wood, slightly warped, with a simple latch. The kind of gate that a garden had rather than the kind a compound did. The kind that was there to mark a boundary politely rather than enforce one. "I don't know," he said, which was the honest answer. Ginny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The lane barely gets any traffic. She said so." "She did. And it's Devon." "I know. It's quite peaceful in Devon." "I know it is." She didn't say anything else. She looked at the front of the cottage again, the rose canes, the pale stone, the south-facing windows with their restored sash frames. Her expression was the one she used when she was deciding something, weighing something, not quite ready to land. Patricia came back down the path with her folder and her smile and her yellow scarf, and said that they were very welcome to take their time. There was no pressure at all. She had 2 other viewings this week, but nothing confirmed, and she'd be happy to answer any further questions. Harry shook her hand and thanked her. He managed to do this without asking about the sight line from the eastern field, which he thought showed considerable restraint. They walked back to where they'd parked, a small road just off the village green, the kind of village that had a pub and a post office and an honesty box for eggs outside a farm gate. And Harry put his hands in his pockets and looked at the ground. Ginny walked beside him without speaking, a habit she had. She didn't fill silences with reassurance. She let them be what they were. After a while, Harry said, "I like the study." Ginny glanced at him. "The empty one at the end?" "The shelves." He paused. "I've never had a proper bookshelf." She looked at him for a moment with the particular attention she kept for things that mattered. Not surprise. Ginny rarely looked surprised by the things he said, which was one of the reasons he said them. Just attention. "We could have a lot of bookshelves," she said, "wherever we end up." "Yeah." They reached the car. Harry unlocked it and stood with his hand on the door. "I kept counting exits," he said. It came out simply, without the performance of confession. Just a fact, offered. Ginny looked at him over the roof of the car. "I know," she said. "I couldn't stop doing it." "I know. I watched you do it from the sitting room." She paused. "The south window. You came in, looked at it, and then immediately looked at the glass door to the garden and the angle to the hedge." He exhaled. Not quite a laugh. Not quite anything else. "Was it that obvious?" "To me." She said this without judgment. Not to Patricia. He looked at the village green. A dog was crossing it with the focused intention of a dog who knew exactly where it was going. 2 children were sitting on the bench near the war memorial, eating something. A normal Saturday morning in a normal place going about its normal business, entirely undisturbed. "It's a nice house," he said. "It is. The light is good." "It really is." He got in the car. Ginny got in the other side. For a moment, neither of them moved. "We'll find the right one," she said. Harry nodded. He started the engine, and they pulled out of the village. and he didn't look back at the lane that led to the cottage, with the thin hedgerow and the accessible gate and the south-facing windows full of silver light. But he thought about the empty shelves. He thought about them for quite a long time. They didn't talk about it on the drive home. This was not avoidance, or at least Harry didn't think it was. It was more that the Devon cottage was still sitting in the air between them, not quite resolved, and pushing at it too soon felt like the wrong instinct. Ginny had the radio on low, some muggle station that was playing something with a lot of piano, and the countryside moved past the windows in its grey and green way, and Harry watched it without really seeing it. He was thinking about the gate, not in the way he'd been thinking about it at the cottage, not tactically, not in terms of approach vectors and ward coverage, in a different way, a way that was less comfortable. He was thinking about why he'd been thinking about it that way, about the fact that he had stood in a perfectly ordinary Devon garden on a perfectly ordinary Saturday morning, and his mind had immediately, without consultation, begun calculating vulnerabilities. It was the kind of thing that was hard to explain to someone who hadn't lived the way he had. He understood that. He didn't say this with any self-pity. It was simply true, the way certain things were simply true. You could not spend the better part of 7 years being specifically and personally hunted, could not spend the months he had spent moving from place to place, eating badly, sleeping in a tent, maintaining wards over every location like a second skin of attention. You could not do all of that and then simply stop. The war had been over for nearly 3 years. Voldemort was gone in the way that something could be definitively, irreversibly gone. The Death Eaters who remained were imprisoned or scattered or quietly rebuilding lives under watchful ministry eyes. There was no credible threat. Robards had told him this directly, more than once, in the particular tone of a man who respected what Harry had been through, but also needed him to function properly on Monday mornings. Harry knew this. He believed it in the rational part of himself. And yet, Molly had left a pot of soup on the hob when they got back, with a note propped against it in her rounded handwriting. Back by 4. There's bread in the basket. Don't let Ron eat it all before you've had some. Ginny read the note and smiled and went to find the bread. Harry lifted the lid on the soup. Leek and potato, the smell of it, immediately and aggressively homely, and replaced it and stood at the hob for a moment, looking at nothing in particular. Bowls, Ginny said, and he found them. They ate at the kitchen table with the soup and the bread and a pot of tea, and outside the sky had finally committed to actual rain, soft and steady against the window, and the kitchen was warm in the way the Burrow's kitchen was always warm. Not just temperature, but something denser than that. Harry ate half. The cottage, he said. The exits thing, the cottage, he said. The exits thing, the hedge. You don't have to explain it, she said. I want to. He looked at his soup. I want to try. She nodded once and waited. Harry took a breath. He found, when he tried to organize this, that it was less like explaining something he understood and more like describing something while it was still happening, something that didn't yet have clean edges. When I think about a place being safe, he said slowly, what I mean is, I can see the whole perimeter. I know where the entry points are. I know if the wards are holding, if there's coverage, if there's somewhere to go, if something comes from the east rather than the He stopped. You see what I mean. That's what safe means to me. The absence of vulnerability. The absence of gaps. Ginny was listening with the still, direct attention she gave to things she was taking seriously. And I know, Harry continued, I know that's not what you mean. When you said you wanted sun, when you stood in that sitting room and just... He gestured, a loose motion with one hand that was trying to replicate the way she'd stood with her arms out. I know you were feeling something completely different. What do you think I was feeling? She said. He considered. Something about the room being good, the light being right, whether it was a place you could be in. Yes, she said simply. That's it. That's not how I look at rooms. I know. I don't know how to do that, he said. Look at a room and feel whether it's right. I look at a room and I feel whether it's... He searched for the word. Defensible. The word sat on the table between them. It was a strange word for a kitchen table on a rainy Saturday, Harry thought. A strange word for soup and bread and a pot of tea. But it was the right word, the accurate one. And he had learned, partly from Ginny, partly from the years of carrying things that felt too heavy to put down, that accurate words were better than comfortable ones. Ginny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are we hiding, or are we living? She said it gently, not as a challenge, more like a question she was genuinely asking, that she genuinely wanted him to think about. Harry looked at her. The question was simple enough on the surface. 7 words, plainly arranged. But it landed somewhere underneath his ribs and stayed there. And he found he couldn't immediately form a response because the response required knowing the answer, and the answer required something he hadn't quite faced yet. He thought about the tent. The months in the tent, moving every few days, never staying long enough to leave a trace. He and Ron and Hermione wearing the Horcrux in shifts, the weight of it settling differently on each of them. The particular skill he had developed during those months. The automatic, constant calibration of surroundings. Where's the nearest cover? What's the sound profile of this area? How long since anyone checked the perimeter? He had been very good at it. It had kept them alive. He thought about Privet Drive, the cupboard under the stairs. He had been young enough, small enough, to fit in it easily at first. It was only as he got older that it became cramped, that he had to angle himself to sleep. And there was something. He touched this carefully, the way you touch something that might still be sore. There was something that he had not quite admitted, which was that the cupboard had also, in a way he hated acknowledging, felt safe, contained, known. You could not be surprised in a cupboard. You knew exactly where the walls were. He had learned very early that small and enclosed meant predictable, and predictable had been the closest thing to safety that he had access to. I don't know, he said. We're supposed to be doing. The war is we're supposed to be doing. The war is over and we're fine and there's no... He stopped. But my head keeps doing the other thing. And I can't always tell the difference between being careful and being... Stuck, Ginny said. He looked at her. She didn't say it unkindly. She said it the way she said most true things. Directly, without dressing it up, but with enough care in her voice that the directness didn't cut. Stuck, he repeated. In a different time, she said. In a different... She paused, choosing her words. You spent a long time making yourself very small in order to survive. In Privet Drive, and then all of it. And I think maybe your idea of safe got formed in that time, when you were—" She looked for it. "When small and defended was all you had." Harry was quiet. Outside, the rain continued its soft persistence against the window. The soup had gone slightly cooler. The tea needed refreshing. "I didn't know I was doing it," he said, finally. "I think you do it without noticing," Ginny said, "which is different from choosing it." He looked at his hands on the table. Ordinary hands. He had never quite gotten used to seeing his hands without the particular tension that had lived in them for years. The readiness, the grip reflex. They looked relaxed now, resting on the table. Sometimes they still surprised him. "What does it feel like," he said, "when you're in a room and it's right?" Ginny considered this with the seriousness it deserved. She didn't answer immediately, which meant she was actually thinking about it rather than offering the first thing that came. "It feels like—" She paused. "Like I could put something down," she said. "Like I could set something on the windowsill and not worry about whether I'd have to pick it up again quickly. Like the room would hold it." Harry thought about this. He thought, the careful neutrality of someone naming a thing. The not worrying. "I've never felt that," he said. Not with sadness, quite. More with the careful neutrality of someone naming a fact about themselves. Ginny looked at him steadily. "I know. How do you learn it?" She reached across the table again and touched his hand. Not the brief touch from the morning at the Burrow. This one stayed. Her hand over his, warm from the tea mug. "I think you practice it," she said. "I think you find the right room, and you practice putting something down." Arthur came home at 4:15 in a state of considerable excitement about a muggle device he had found at a car boot sale, a thing he was calling a digital organizer that appeared to have no battery, but which, when you pressed a certain combination of buttons, played a small fragment of a song. "It's called a jingle," Arthur said, pressing the buttons repeatedly to demonstrate. They put them in devices to make people feel cheerful about the device. "Does it work?" Ron asked. "I feel quite cheerful about it," Arthur said with complete sincerity. Harry sat in the armchair by the fire and watched the familiar evening assemble itself around him. Arthur with his device, Ron with his chess pieces, Hermione with her book, Molly producing dinner with the inevitability of tide. He felt the warmth of it, and underneath the warmth, he turned over what Ginny had said. The way you turned a stone over to look at what was under it. Are we hiding or are we living? He thought about Hogwarts. He hadn't thought about it quite this way before, but he thought about it now. About the way the castle had felt in the early years. Not entirely safe, not by any measurement he could have put numbers to. It had had its dungeons and its moving staircases and its general policy of mild architectural hostility. Voldemort had been there, embedded in the back of a professor's head. There had been a basilisk in the walls, and yet there had been something about the great hall in the mornings, the long tables, the light from the enchanted ceiling, the noise of several hundred people beginning a day. He had sat at breakfast and felt something that he was only now, at 21, beginning to name properly. Not the absence of danger. There had been danger, frequently. Something else. Something about the scale of the place. The fact that it was larger than any individual thing happening in it. The fact that it held everything, the ordinary and the terrible, and continued. He had felt, in the great hall, like he could be one thing among many things. Not the boy who lived, not the one with the scar, just a person eating breakfast in a building that had been doing this for 1,000 years and would continue doing it long after he was done. That was something, he thought. That was a version of safety he hadn't quite recognized as such. Not defended, not warded, just held. Just part of something that had room for him. He looked across the sitting room at Ginny, who was reading now, legs folded under her in the armchair opposite, entirely absorbed. She had a habit of going very still when she read, as though the book created a kind of gravity around her. I could put something down, she'd said, like the room would hold it. He thought about the empty bookshelves in the study at the Devon cottage, the way the room had felt, small and quiet and waiting. He had almost been able to imagine something there, some future version of a morning, some arrangement of things on those shelves that would be his rather than Charlie's, his rather than borrowed. He had stopped himself because it had felt like assuming too much. But perhaps he turned this over carefully. Perhaps that was the thing Ginny was talking about, not the absence of threat, not a covered perimeter, just the willingness to imagine the object on the windowsill and to believe quietly that it would still be there tomorrow. He had not believed that, he realized, for a very long time. Maybe, he thought, that was where you started. That night, before sleep, he lay in Charlie's room, looking at the Romanian Longhorn poster on the inside of the wardrobe door, which he'd left open as he sometimes did when the room felt too closed. He thought about the question Ginny had asked him. Are we hiding or are we living? He didn't have the full answer yet. He suspected the full answer was the kind that arrives slowly, through practice rather than through deciding. But he thought, turning toward it carefully, the way you turn toward something bright. He thought he was beginning to understand what the question was actually asking. Not are you safe? Are you here? He closed the wardrobe door gently, so the poster disappeared, and lay in the dark of a room that was not his, and thought about rooms that might be, and what it would take to learn to stay in them. The Wiltshire house was Hermione's suggestion. She had found it in a different supplement. Not the Witch Weekly one, but something more specific. A quarterly publication put out by a small wizarding estate agency in Salisbury that apparently catered to what the listing described as discerning magical homeowners seeking properties with established protective potential and proximity to both muggle and wizarding amenities. Hermione had circled it in pencil and left it on the kitchen table without comment, which was her way of having an opinion while technically not having offered one. Harry had looked at the listing photograph for a long time. It was larger than the Devon cottage, 2 stories, pale stone, early 19th century, by the look of the proportions. Set back from a lane behind a low stone wall, with iron gates that stood open in the photograph, as though whoever had taken the picture had decided that open was the appropriate state for them. The gardens were mature, old trees, a kitchen garden that had gone a bit wild along its windows. He had noted them specifically as windows. He had noted them specifically as a potential problem. Then he had looked at the photograph again, at the way the light was sitting in the upper windows, and thought about what Ginny had said, like the room would hold it. And he had taken the supplement upstairs and knocked on the bathroom door where Ginny was and slid it underneath without saying anything. She had come out 10 minutes later with her hair damp and the supplement in her hand, and she had looked at him and said, "Saturday." "Saturday," he said. They took the train this time. Ginny had suggested it. The Devon drive had been fine, she said, but there was something about trains that she liked. The particular rhythm of them. The way the world went past at a speed that allowed you to actually look at it. Harry had agreed without much deliberation. He had always had a complicated relationship with trains, coloured inevitably by the Hogwarts Express. The first one, the 11-year-old one, when he had stepped onto the platform not knowing a single person and stepped off it at the other end with something new and unexpected in his chest. But the complication was the good kind, the kind that made trains feel significant in a way that was mostly pleasant. They found seats by the window, and Ginny had a book and Harry had a coffee he didn't particularly want, but found himself drinking anyway, and the Wiltshire countryside moved past in its winter paleness. Ploughed fields, bare hedgerows, the occasional cluster of farm buildings, the sky doing its February thing of being present without committing to anything. Hermione thinks the protective potential means the foundations are old enough to hold serious warding, Ginny said, without looking up from her book. That's what she'd notice. It's not wrong. No, Harry said. It's not wrong. Ginny turned a page. But it's also not the main thing. Harry looked out the window. A canal was running alongside the track for a stretch, grey and still, a narrow boat moored at a bank with a thin thread of smoke from its chimney. "What is the main thing?" he said. "The windows," Ginny said simply. The estate agent for this one was a wizard, a quiet man named Thorpe, middle-aged, with the careful manner of someone who dealt primarily in properties where the clients had specific and sometimes unusual requirements and had learned to ask few questions. He met them at the gate, which was still standing open, as it had been in the photograph, and Harry noticed immediately that this struck him as less of a problem than it had at Devon. He wasn't sure why. The house was set further back than the listing had suggested. There was a longer approach through the garden than the photograph implied, the gravel path curving slightly through the old trees before arriving at the front door. The trees were bare, but they were large, and Harry could see that in summer they would make the approach shaded and private. A copper beech on the left side, he thought, the copper colour still in the bark even in winter, that particular reddish-brown. The front of the house was pale stone. Limestone, he thought, or something close to it, with a slight weathering that was not dilapidation, but age, the kind of surface that had been rained on a great many times and had absorbed it. 3 large windows on the ground floor, 2 on either side of the door, and one slightly to the right of centre that was taller than the others, running almost floor to ceiling. "That's the kitchen window," Thorpe said, following Harry's gaze. "Original, 1840s. The owners before last put in underfloor heating. They were very concerned about the cold, apparently. But they had the sense to leave the windows as they were." Harry nodded. He was doing the thing again, taking inventory, noting the gate, the approach, the angles. He knew he was doing it. He watched himself do it from somewhere slightly above, with the patient acknowledgement that it was going to happen and the quiet effort to not let it be the only thing happening. Are we hiding or are we living? He made himself look at the copper beach. He made himself know that it was beautiful. Inside, the hallway was wider than the Devon cottage, pale flagstone again, but higher ceilinged, the staircase running up on the right in a long, elegant curve that had a carved wooden banister worn smooth along the top from decades of hands. The light from the tall kitchen window carried through from the back of the house, and even on this grey February morning, it was remarkable. Not the silver diffusion of Devon, but something warmer, the stone walls holding it and giving it back slightly changed. Thorpe took them through the sitting room on the left. Good proportions. 2 south-facing windows with original shutters folded back. The shutters painted the particular pale blue that old houses sometimes had in their woodwork. The paint thickened and cracked in the way of many coats applied over many years. Harry looked at the windows. South-facing, large, accessible from the front garden. He turned away and looked at the fireplace instead, which was wide and deep and had an iron grate and a mantel of carved stone with some decorative detail along it that he couldn't quite make out. He made himself stand in the room rather than immediately cataloguing it. The room was... He searched for the word Ginny had used. He tried to feel whether it was a room where you could put something down. He wasn't sure yet. It was a good room. He thought it was a good room. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and that was where it happened. Thorpe opened the door from the hallway and stepped aside, and Ginny went in first, and she stopped. Not because anything required her to stop, not because the room was from outside, a large central table from outside, a large central table of scrubbed pine, the kind of table that suggested decades of use. An Aga against the far wall, dark green, the kind that was perpetually warm. Ginny stopped in the middle of the room, and she breathed. Harry watched her from the doorway. She wasn't looking at anything in particular. She wasn't inspecting the counters or checking the light or making the small considering movements that people made when they were evaluating a space. She was just in it, standing in the kitchen with her arms slightly loose at her sides and her face doing something that was not quite an expression, something quieter than an expression, something that was simply present. The light came through the tall window in a long, even pour across the stone floor, reaching almost to the central table. Even in February, even on a grey morning, it was extraordinary. The quality of it, the way it moved the room from neutral to warm without doing anything dramatic. Just light, falling where light falls when the window is right and the aspect is right, and someone, 180 years ago, put the window there because they understood something about mornings. Thorpe was saying something about the Aga, make, age, fuel type. His voice was quiet and professional, going about its business. Harry wasn't listening to Thorpe. He was watching Ginny breathe. She exhaled slowly. Not a sigh, not relief exactly, but the particular release of breath that happened when something settled. When the thing you had been unconsciously holding turned out to be all right. She looked up at the window, and the light caught her face, and she had an expression he recognized. He had seen it at the Burrow, at Christmas, at particular moments that had nothing to do with occasion and everything to do with being in exactly the right place. She looked like she was home, not the Burrow's version of home, not familiar, not inherited. Something else, something that she was choosing, standing in this kitchen on a February morning in a house she had never been in before today. She was choosing it with her body before her mind had finished deciding the way certain things were chosen. Harry stood in the doorway and felt something shift in him. He had been trying since Devon to understand what she meant. He had turned her words over, like the room would hold it, and he had found the idea logical, had found himself able to follow the thought. But understanding it as an idea and seeing it in front of him were different things. This was different. He was watching someone be at home in a place. Actually at home. Not comfortable, not pleased, but located. The particular quality of a person who is exactly where they are, without any part of them somewhere else. He had felt this at Hogwarts. He recognized, and now, from the far side of it, he had felt it in the Great Hall occasionally, in the library late at night, when the castle was quiet and he was the only one there. In Dumbledore's office, which he had hated visiting for years, and which had nevertheless felt like a place that held things. He had felt it, he thought, the first time he had walked into the Weasley kitchen and stood there covered in flue ash, knowing no one. He had felt it in a way he couldn't name then because he had no frame for naming it. But he had never felt it, he realized, about any place he was supposed to be in charge of. Any place that was his to maintain, his to ward, his to manage, his to make right. He didn't know how. Ginny turned from the window and looked at him, and her face was open in the way it only was when she wasn't managing it, not arranging an expression, just there. "Harry," she said, "come in here." He stepped into the kitchen properly, away from the doorway, and the light reached him immediately. That long pour from the tall window, warm even in February, lying across the floor like something intentional. He stood in it. He looked at the window, at the garden visible through it, the kitchen garden with its slightly wild edges, the stone wall at the back, the bare branches of something espaliered against the wall. An apple tree, he thought, or pear, possibly. Trained against the stone over many years, the branches spread and fixed in their patient horizontal lines. He looked at the table, the pine table, scrubbed and worn, the surface of it marked with the particular history of a table that had been used for its actual purpose. Cuts, stains, the slight bowl shape along the center from years of things being placed on it. He thought about sitting at this table, in the morning, with a cup of tea, with the light coming through the window like this, he let the image form, cautiously, the way you let a fire catch, with Ginny across from him, reading, a moment later, the habit of it, a moment later, the habit of it, the reflex. But it arrived later, after the other thought, after the image of the morning. That, he thought, was something different. That was a small difference that felt significant in a way he couldn't fully articulate yet. "The table," he said. Ginny looked at him. "You said," he paused, "you said you wanted to decide where the table goes. This table." He looked at it. "This one doesn't need to go anywhere. It's already." He stopped because he wasn't sure where the sentence was going. But Ginny smiled. Not the small private smile, the larger one, the easy one. "It's already right," she said. "Yeah," Harry said. "It's already right." Thorpe was still talking about the Arga, its reliability, the supplier for the fuel. His voice moved through the room at a professional distance, giving them space they hadn't asked for, but which they were quietly grateful for. Harry stood in the light from the tall window and looked at the kitchen, the table, the Aga, the stone floor, the slightly wild garden outside, and felt something he didn't immediately have a word for. Not safe, not in the way he had been measuring safety. Something more like the possibility of it, the possibility of a different kind. The kind that wasn't about gaps in the hedgerow, the kind that started from inside. They walked the rest of the house after that. The bedrooms upstairs, the study with its built-in shelves again, a smaller room at the back that Thorpe called a morning room, and that had a window seat with faded cushions and a view over the kitchen garden. Harry stood at the window seat and looked at the espaliered tree against the stone wall and thought that someone had trained it with considerable patience, that it had taken years, that whoever had done it had been thinking about the future of a thing, its shape in 10 years, its fruit in 20. On the way down the stairs, Ginny put her hand in his. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. Downstairs, in the hallway, with the light still coming from the kitchen at the back and the pale stone walls holding it, Harry looked at the staircase banister, the worn, smooth top of it, the accumulated passage of hands. He thought, someone lived here well. And then, carefully, tentatively, like putting something down on a windowsill and stepping back, someone could again. Harry found the third house himself. This felt important, in a way he didn't examine too closely. He had been the one to notice the listing, not in a supplement, not through Hermione's pencil-circled suggestions, but in a small classified section at the back of the Daily Prophet that he had been reading at the Burrow kitchen table on a Tuesday evening when everyone else had gone to bed. A 3-line entry, almost aggressively minimal. Godric's Hollow, adjacent, detached stone, established protective features, private approach, viewing by arrangement. He had read it 3 times. Then he had cut it out carefully with the edge of a butter knife, not cleanly, slightly ragged at one corner, and folded it and put it in his pocket. He had not shown it to Ginny that night. He had lain in Charlie's room with the Romanian Longhorn poster visible in the crack of the wardrobe door and thought about the phrase established protective features and felt something in him settle in a way that the Wiltshire house, for all its extraordinary kitchen light, had not quite managed. The Wiltshire house was beautiful. He knew it was beautiful. He knew that Ginny standing in that kitchen had been something real, something that mattered, that the table already being right meant something he was still working through. But established protective features meant old magic, deep-set wards, the kind that grew into a property's foundation over decades, woven into the stone and the soil until they were less like a security measure and more like a characteristic of the place, like the grain in wood, like the lean of a tree that had grown in wind. That, Harry thought, in the small hours of a Tuesday night, was different. That was not hiding. That was just intelligent, responsible, the kind of thing any reasonable person would want. He had believed this quite firmly until approximately 40 minutes into the viewing. The house was on a lane about 2 miles outside Godric's Hollow proper, close enough that Harry could feel the familiarity of the landscape, the particular character of the hills and the hedgerows in this part of the country, but far enough that it was its own place, not an echo of something else. He had thought, when they turned off the main road onto the lane, that this was good, that some distance from the village was probably right, that he did not need to be looking at the church spire every morning. Ginny had said nothing about the proximity to Godric's Hollow. She had looked at him once when he mentioned it, a careful look, and then nodded and said she thought it might be worth seeing. The agent this time was a young wizard named Prentice, who was new enough to the job that he still read from his notes and had not yet developed the practiced ease of Thorpe or the professional warmth of Patricia Holloway. He had a clipboard. He checked things off it. The property dates to approximately 1760, Prentice said, reading. Original owner was a wizard family, the Cavendish Pretts, who held it until 1943. There have been 4 owners since. The current owners have been in residence for 11 years and are relocating to Edinburgh. He looked up. The protective enchantments were put in place by the Cavendish Pretts and have been maintained and added to by each subsequent owner. The estate agency has had them assessed. They're quite substantial. What kind? Harry said. Prentice checked his clipboard. Perimeter wards, anti-apparition on the interior. Notice me. Not on the approach. Muggle repelling on the lane from the main road junction. A Fidelius framework that was never fully activated, but whose foundation remains intact and could be completed. Could be completed, Harry repeated. In theory, yes. The groundwork is there. It would require a secret keeper, obviously, and the full casting. But the infrastructure, right. Harry was nodding. He was aware, distantly, that he was nodding with a particular energy. Right, yes. Yes. Ginny was looking at the front of the house. The house was, Harry looked at it now, trying to see it as she was seeing it. Stone, yes, good solid stone. A darker grey than the Wiltshire limestone, more austere. 3 stories. Narrow windows on the upper floors, not small exactly, but proportioned in the way of a house that had been built with winters in mind, with the emphasis on keeping warmth in, rather than letting light in. A low porch over the front door, solid stone, no decorative detail. The front garden was private, very private, enclosed on all sides by a mature yew hedge that was at least 8 feet tall and dense enough that you could not see through it from anywhere on the lane. The yew hedge was, Harry thought, excellent. He could see this was not the thought Ginny was having. Inside, the house was cold in the way of a property that had been empty for 2 months. Not the cold of disrepair, but the cold of absence, the particular chill that settled into a house when the Aga was not lit and no one had been breathing in the rooms. Prentice apologized for it and said the current owners had been in Edinburgh for some time. The hallway was stone-floored, narrow, with a staircase directly ahead that went up in a straight line rather than the curve of the Wiltshire house. The walls were panelled in dark wood that had been painted over at some point and was now somewhere between brown and grey. The ceiling was low. Harry thought, good acoustics. You'd hear anyone on those stairs from anywhere on the ground floor. Ginny looked at the ceiling. He watched her look at it. She didn't say anything. The sitting room on the left was a reasonable size, with a fireplace and 2 windows facing the front garden. The yew hedge was visible through the windows, that dense, dark green, blocking the view of the lane entirely. Completely private, no sightline from outside. Good, Harry said, mostly to himself. The previous owners used this as a library, Prentice offered, consulting his notes. They had shelves on all four walls. Harry looked at the walls and thought about shelves. He thought about the bookshelves in the study at Devon, the bookshelves in Wiltshire. He thought about his own absence of bookshelves. That would work, he said. Ginny was at one of the windows, looking out at the yew hedge. Her back was to the room. He could not see her face. "You can't see anything through it," she said. "Exactly," Harry said. "That's the point. Nobody can see in from the lane." "No," she said. "You can't see out either." A small silence. "The garden is enclosed," Harry said. "There's space within the hedge. It's a large perimeter. You'd have the full garden to—" Ginny said, which was not agreement and not disagreement, and which Harry had learned over 2 years of marriage to treat with some caution. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and this, Harry felt, would be better. The back garden was where the kitchen window looked out, and the back garden was— he looked at it through the glass, enclosed by a high stone wall, very old, with an iron door set into it that was secured with both a muggle padlock and what appeared to be a magical seal on the frame. "The iron door," Harry said, "leads to a small courtyard and then another wall," Prentice said, checking his clipboard. "And then the outer perimeter, 3 layers of enclosure on the rear aspect." 3 layers, Harry said. He turned to Ginny. She was standing in the kitchen, not in the way she had stood in the Wiltshire kitchen, not with her arms loose and her breath settling and her face doing that quiet, present thing. She was standing in the kitchen in the way you stood in a room you were politely assessing. Her hands were in her coat pockets. She was looking at the window. The window was not small, but it faced north, and the courtyard beyond it was enclosed, and the February light that reached it was thin and grey and did not pour. "The Arga's good," Harry said. It was. He could see it, older than the Wiltshire one, black rather than green, solid in the way of something very old and very reliable. Ginny looked at the Arga. She said again. Harry looked at the table. It was a smaller table than the Wiltshire one, a darker wood, square, pushed against the wall on one side. It would fit 4 people if they were friendly about it. He thought about the Wiltshire table, the scrubbed pine, the worn centre, the sense of it already being right. He thought, this table is fine. There was a difference between right and fine, and he was only just standing in this kitchen, beginning to understand it in his body rather than his head. Upstairs were 4 bedrooms, and Harry moved through them with Prentice, talking about original features and the condition of the floors and the view from the master. And he was listening with one part of his attention while another part was doing the inventory he always did, and a third part, newer, less practiced, was trying to feel the rooms. The master bedroom was at the front of the house, over the porch, with 2 windows looking out over the yew hedge and the lane beyond, invisible behind the hedge, just the dark green of it, and then sky. He stood at the window and looked at the hedge and tried to feel whether the room was right. It was a good room. He could not fault the room. The ceiling was reasonable height, the floors were good, the fireplace worked. Prentice had confirmed this. The windows were double aspect if you counted the small one on the side wall, which gave good coverage of the approach from the east. But the room had the same quality as the kitchen, the same fine, the same sense of a thing being technically correct and somehow not quite. He thought about Ginny in the Wiltshire bedroom, standing at the windows with the south light on her face, looking at the front garden, noting that you could see the whole front from here, saying it with pleasure, not strategy, seeing it as abundance, not advantage. He looked at the yew hedge and thought about abundance. He was not sure the hedge spoke of abundance. They had tea in the village afterwards, a small tea room near the church, the kind that had been a tea room for so long it no longer needed to try. Prentice had gone, clipboard and all, leaving them with particulars and his card and a cheerful assurance that there had been significant interest, but nothing confirmed. Harry wrapped both hands around his mug and said, "I think it's the one." Ginny looked at him over her tea. "The protective features are extraordinary," he said. "The Fidelius Foundation alone, and the perimeter, 3 layers, and the warding is already established. We wouldn't have to build it from scratch. It's already in the stone." Harry. "And the approach is private. The lane charm means muggles won't even register it. And the yew hedge is... It's proper coverage. You can't see in from any angle." Harry. Her voice was still gentle, but it had the particular quality of someone who needed him to stop and look at her. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. There was something in her face, not frustration, not disappointment, something more careful than either, something that was deciding how to say a thing. "It felt like a fortress," she said. "It felt secure," he said. "Yes." She put her mug down. "That's what I said." A silence. Outside, through the tea room window, the village went about its quiet business. An elderly woman with a shopping bag, a cat on a wall, a postman doing his round with the particular, unhurried pace of someone who had been doing the same route for 20 years. "The kitchen," Ginny said. "Did you notice the kitchen? The Aga is excellent. The window faces north," she said. "The courtyard is 3 walls of stone. There is no light in that kitchen, Harry. Not in winter, barely in summer. That's where we'd spend most of our time in a house, and it would be..." She paused. "It would be dark." Harry thought about the kitchen. He thought about the north-facing window and the enclosed courtyard and the thin grey light. He thought about the Wiltshire kitchen, the extraordinary pour of it, the light lying across the stone floor. "The sitting room has south windows," he said. But even as he said it, he could hear the quality of it, the sound of a person building a case they weren't entirely convinced by. Ginny heard it too. She said nothing. Harry put his mug down. He looked at the table in the tea room, a small round thing with a lace cloth, the kind of table that was specifically a tea room table, nothing else. Through the window, the cat on the wall was washing its face with the meditative focus that cats brought to this activity. "Ron," said a voice from the doorway, and Harry looked up to see Ron himself, in a coat slightly too large for him, looking surprised, and then not surprised in the particular way Ron had of cycling through expressions quickly. "What are you doing here?" Harry said. "Hermione's mum lives 20 minutes away," Ron said, unwinding his scarf and sitting down at their table with the confidence of someone who had decided this was fine. "We come down sometimes. She likes that antique place on the main road." He looked at them both. "You were looking at a house?" "Yes," Ginny said. "How was it?" Harry opened his mouth. Ron looked at him. He looked at him with the attention of someone who had known Harry for 10 years and could read the particular configuration of his face with some accuracy. "Was it the fortress one?" Ron said. Harry stared at him. "What do you mean, the fortress one?" Hermione said there was a listing near Godric's Hollow with about 40 layers of protection on it. Ron flagged down the waitress for a tea. "She said you'd probably love it, and that Ginny would probably—" He glanced at Ginny. "She said there might be a difference of opinion." "There's not a difference of opinion," Harry said. "We're still discussing." "Mate," Ron said, with the simple directness that he deployed occasionally, and which, when he deployed it, was usually accurate. "You're trying to build Hogwarts." Harry went still. Ron accepted his tea from the waitress, added an amount of sugar that Hermione would have had views about, and stirred it. "I mean, Hogwarts had, every protection known to wizard kind. Moving staircases, basically impenetrable from outside, you couldn't even apparate in. And it was home, right? For all of us." He paused, considering his own point. "But that's not why it was home. It was home because of the Great Hall, and the dormitories, and McGonagall telling you off, and the smell of the library. The protection was just the walls. The home was inside the walls." He drank his tea, apparently unaware that he had just said something that landed in Harry's chest with the weight of a thing that had been waiting to be said. Harry looked at Ginny. She was looking at Ron with an expression that was trying not to be too satisfied with this development, and not entirely succeeding. "I'm trying to build Hogwarts," Harry said slowly. "Little bit," Ron said, with some kindness. Harry looked out the window. The cat had finished its ablutions and was now sitting in the perfect stillness of a cat that had completed its business and found the world acceptable. The kitchen had no light, Harry said, to no one in particular. "Important kitchens," Ron said, helping himself to the biscuit that had come with Harry's tea. "Ginny stood in the Wiltshire kitchen," Harry said, still not quite talking to anyone, "and just breathed." Ron looked at Ginny. Ginny said nothing, but something in her face had gone very quiet and very still, in the way it went when she was feeling something she was choosing not to perform. "Sounds like you've already found it then," Ron said, simply. Harry turned this over. The fortress house, with its 3 perimeter layers and its Fidelius foundation and its excellent yew hedge, sat in one part of his mind, solid and correct and fine. The Wiltshire house, with its unscheduled light and its already right table, and Ginny breathing in the kitchen, sat in another part, quieter, less certain, asking something of him he was still learning to give. He thought about Hogwarts, about the Great Hall and the smell of the library and the particular warmth of the common room fire, about how none of those things were protective features, about how all of them were why it was home. He picked up his tea. "I want to see the Wiltshire house again," he said. Ginny looked at him. "Without the viewing," he said. "I want to just walk through it, on my own, before we decide anything." She was quiet for a moment. Then, Okay, Harry said. Ron ate the biscuit, mercifully asking nothing further. Outside, the cat on the wall stood, stretched with the full commitment of a creature for whom stretching was a serious undertaking, and then stepped off the wall and disappeared. Harry watched the empty wall for a moment. Then he finished his tea. He didn't tell Ginny when he was going, not because he was hiding it. He had mentioned the evening after the tea room that he wanted to go on his own, and she had said okay with the particular quality of someone who understood back to whatever she had been reading, and went back to whatever she had been reading, and Harry had felt in that small and unremarkable exchange something of what she had described in the Wiltshire kitchen, like being held without being gripped. He went on a Thursday. The Burrow was quiet in the mornings now. Arthur at the ministry, Molly at some committee she'd joined that seemed to involve a great deal of discussion about post-war magical community support, and a great deal of biscuits, Ron and Hermione, in their own flat in London since Christmas. Harry had the kitchen to himself most mornings, and he had come to value this, the particular quality of the Burrow without its full population, still warm, still itself, but at a lower register. You could hear the house properly when it was quiet. He apparated to a point on the Wiltshire lane that he'd identified on the previous viewing, a gap in the hedgerow about 100 metres from the house where the lane widened slightly, the kind of spot that felt like it had been used as a passing place for farm vehicles for generations. He arrived in the grey Thursday morning and stood for a moment, getting his bearings. The lane was exactly as Thorpe. It was Thorpe's listing. Thorpe, the quiet wizard with the careful manner, as Thorpe had described it. Quiet. A farm vehicle, occasionally in harvest season, otherwise nothing. This morning it was empty in both directions, the hedgerow on either side still and slightly damp from overnight rain, the sky doing its February thing. Harry put his hands in his pockets and walked. He had told himself, on the train down to Devon and on the drive to the fortress house, and in the various mental arguments he had conducted with himself since, that what he was doing at these viewings was rational, that any person with his history would establish these distinctions in a way that he was beginning to suspect suggested the distinctions were less solid than he was making them. Ron had said, "You're trying to build Hogwarts." He had been thinking about this for 4 days. Not the Hogwarts part. He understood the Hogwarts part, had turned it over enough times that he could see it clearly now, the way the fortress house had scratched an itch that was really about wanting the feeling of the castle, the impenetrability of it, the sense that inside those walls you were comprehensively held. He understood that. What he was thinking about, walking down the Wiltshire lane in the grey morning with his hands in his pockets, was the second part of what Ron had said. The protection was just the walls. The home was inside the walls. He thought about Hogwarts at night. The specific texture of it, the way the castle changed register after curfew, the torches lower, the portraits dozing, the sounds different. He had spent more time in Hogwarts at night than most students had any right to. The invisibility cloak had ensured that, had given him access to a version of the castle that existed between the official one and something more private. He thought about a specific night in 5th year, after a particularly bad occlumency lesson with Snape, when he had been so full of anger and humiliation and something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it, that he had walked for nearly 2 hours through the castle, not going anywhere, just walking. And at some point, somewhere between the 7th floor corridor and the staircase that shifted to the east wing, he had found himself simply tired rather than angry, and had sat down on a window seat he didn't recognize and looked out at the grounds, the dark of the lake, the lights of Hagrid's hut, the edge of the forest, and felt something that was not happiness, but was quieter than unhappiness. He had not been safe that night. 5th year had been many things, and safe was not among them. But something about the castle, in the dark, had held him, had continued to exist around him in its enormous, imperturbable way, and in doing so had given him something he couldn't name. He thought, that is what Ginny is talking about. Not safety, not the absence of threat. Something that held you not by keeping things out, but by continuing to be itself around you. He thought about what it would take to build that, whether it was something you built or something you chose, whether there was a difference. The iron gates were standing open again. He stopped at them and looked at the house. Thursday morning, no viewing. No Thorpe with his careful manner and his considered questions. Just the house as it was. The gravel path curving through the bare trees. The ran almost floor to ceiling. He stood at the side, the one that ran almost floor to ceiling. He stood at the gates for a moment. He was aware that he was about to walk through someone else's property without a viewing appointment, which was, well, in the Muggle world, it was trespassing probably. In the Wizarding world, it was also probably trespassing. Thorpe had given him particulars with a card attached. He had the card somewhere. He should have owled ahead. He walked through the gates. The gravel was damp and quiet underfoot. He moved slowly, not because he was trying to be unobtrusive, but because the pace felt right. The pace of someone trying to actually look at something rather than process it. He had spent too much of the previous viewings processing, moving through the rooms at the speed of inventory, clocking exits and sight lines and structural features, and coming out the other side with data rather than anything else. He moved slowly up the path and looked at the copper beech. It was, he looked at it, very old. The trunk was substantial, the bark deeply ridged, the branches spreading in every direction with the assurance of a tree that had been doing this for a long time and saw no reason to stop. In summer it would be. He looked up at the winter branch structure, trying to see the leaves that weren't there yet. The canopy it would make, the shade of it, the particular color of copper beech leaves when the light came through them in late afternoon. He had not thought about a tree in a garden this way before. He thought, Ginny would have names for all of this. She'd know exactly what it does in summer. He made a note to ask her. The house was occupied, smoke from one of the chimneys, a light in an upstairs window, the muffled sound of something from inside that might have been a wireless. Harry stopped on the path and felt, briefly, like an idiot. He had not thought this through. The current owners were still in residence. The house was not empty. He could not simply walk up and look through the windows. He stood on the path for a moment, feeling the particular flavor of having made a plan that had a significant practical gap in it. Then he turned and walked around the side of the house, along the narrow path that ran between the limestone wall and the garden border, toward the back. The kitchen garden was at the back, as he'd seen through the kitchen window on the viewing. The slightly wild edges, the stone wall at the back, the espaliered tree. He stood at the corner of the house where the side path opened into the back garden and looked at it. The kitchen window was lit. He could see, not intrusively, not in a way that invaded anything, but simply as a fact of standing at this angle, the inside of the kitchen. the edge of the scrubbed pine table, the Aga, and the particular glow of it that meant it was lit, that it was doing its perpetual warm work. A figure moving, briefly visible, and then not, between the Aga and the counter. Someone was making breakfast in this kitchen. Someone was in this kitchen in the morning, with the Aga lit and the light from the tall window coming in and the pine table with its worn center nearby. And they were making breakfast, and it was just a Thursday morning. An ordinary Thursday morning, inside a house. Harry stood at the corner of the house and looked at this for a moment that was probably shorter than it felt. Then he turned and went back to the path and stood under the copper beech and looked up at the winter branches. He thought about Dumbledore's office. He had been thinking about it on and off since Devon, returning to it the way you return to something that was trying to tell you something. He had hated going there. In the early years, the summons, the sense of being assessed, the particular discomfort of sitting in front of someone who seemed to know more about your own life than you did. And then later, he had hated going for different reasons, grief-adjacent ones that he still didn't have quite the right language for, but the office had always felt inhabited. That was the word. Not just occupied, not just used, but inhabited in the fullest sense. A place that had the unmistakable quality of someone having lived in it with intention, having accumulated the things that mattered to them and arranged them according to logic that was entirely their own. The pensive on its cabinet, the portraits of the former headmasters sleeping and waking in their frames, the particular instrument on the desk that Harry had once, in a fit of rage, smashed, and which he had felt terrible about afterwards in a way that was partly about the smashing and partly about something it represented. The office had been made by someone living in it, not defended. Made. He thought, that is what I don't know how to do. He could defend a space. He had been defending spaces since he was 11 years old, since before he knew that was what he was doing. But making one, filling it with the accumulation of a life lived in it with intention, that was different. That required believing the life would continue. That required, at the most basic level, putting something down on a shelf and expecting it to be there tomorrow. He stood under the copper beech and understood something. He had been, without quite admitting it, waiting for the other shoe, for the thing that always came. The pattern of his life until the age of 17 had been a reliable alternation between peace and catastrophe, and the peace had always been temporary, had always had the quality of borrowed time. The Dursleys had made sure he understood that his presence was conditional. Hogwarts had been wonderful and also repeatedly the site of mortal danger. Every year, some new form of the pattern, settling in, learning to breathe, and then he was 21. The war had been over for 3 years. Nothing was coming. He knew this. He believed it. In the rational part of himself, had believed it for some time. But a different part, older, less rational, the part that had learned its lessons in a cupboard under some stairs. That part was still waiting, still doing the inventory, still counting exits, still, at some fundamental level, expecting to need them. He put his hand on the bark of the copper beech. The texture of it was remarkable, deeply ridged, slightly damp from the overnight rain, the solidity of it considerable. A tree that had been standing in this garden for perhaps 100 years. a tree that had no idea anything was coming and was correct in this assessment. He thought about Ginny in the kitchen, the way she had breathed. She was not naive. That was the thing he needed to hold on to. She was not someone who had been sheltered from what the world could do. She had been at Hogwarts in the year. He hadn't. The year under the Carrows. The year that no one in the Burrow talked about in any detail. She had fought at the Battle of Hogwarts. She had lost Fred. She was not unacquainted with catastrophe. And she had stood in that kitchen and breathed. And the breathing had been about choosing to be where she was. Not because nothing bad would ever happen, but because the kitchen was where she was, and it was right, and she was choosing to be in it. That, Harry thought, was a different kind of courage than the kind he was familiar with. He was familiar with the courage of facing something terrible. He had done that. He had walked into the forest at 17 to die, and he had found that he could do it. That kind of courage he understood. This was different. This was the courage of a Tuesday morning, the courage of putting something on a windowsill, the courage of standing in a kitchen and breathing as though the kitchen would be there tomorrow. He was not sure he knew how to do that, but he thought, turning this over, standing under the copper beech in the grey February morning, he thought perhaps knowing you don't know is where you start. Not the arrival, just the facing of the direction. He looked up at the winter branches of the copper beech one more time, tried to see the summer in them, the canopy, the colour of the leaves with afternoon light coming through. It was there, he thought, not visible yet, but structurally present. The tree knew where it was going, even in February, even without leaves. The knowledge was in the wood. He took his hand off the bark. He walked back down the gravel path, past the iron gates standing open in their apparently permanent state, and onto the lane. He stood on the lane for a moment in the grey morning. Then he took out his wand and conjured a Patronus. It came immediately. The stag, silver and enormous and calm in the way it always was, the way it had been since the first time he'd produced it in third year under Lupin's instruction. It stood in the lane and looked at him with the particular patience of a thing that had all the time in the world. Harry looked at it. He had never thought about what the Patronus meant, beyond what Lupin had told him, that it was the embodiment of the caster's most powerful positive memory, the distillation of something the Dementors couldn't touch. He had used it as a tool, a defense, a means of communication. He had not thought much about what it was saying. He looked at the stag now and thought about his father, whom he had not known. Thought about the marauders and the map and the particular bravery of a group of 17-year-old boys deciding to become animagi, so one of them wouldn't have to be alone. Thought about what it was to do something enormous for someone you loved without asking anything back. The stag looked at him with silver eyes. Harry thought, Ginny is waiting for me to call. He took out his wand and sent the Patronus ahead of him down the lane. Not as a message, just as a thing to watch. The silver stag moving through the grey February morning at its own unhurried pace until it reached the end of the lane and dissolved quietly into the cold air. Then he disapparated. Back at the Burrow, Ginny was in the kitchen with a cup of tea and the prophet, her legs folded under her in the chair the way she always sat. She looked up when he came in. "How was it?" she said. Harry sat down across from her. He put both hands on the table. There was someone making breakfast, he said. In the kitchen. The Aga was lit and I could see the table and… He paused. It looked like a Thursday morning. Ginny waited. I want to put an offer in, Harry said. I want us to put an offer in. Something in Ginny's face went very quiet and very still in the way it did when she was feeling something she wasn't going to perform. Okay, she said. I don't know how to do what you do, Harry said. In rooms, the breathing thing. I don't know how to do that yet. He looked at his hands. But I think I want to learn. Ginny reached across the table. She put her hand over his, warm from the tea mug. We've got time, she said. Harry looked at their hands on the table. The Burrow kitchen settled around them in its warm, familiar way. The copper pots, the clock with its 9 hands, the slight lean of the far ceiling that Arthur was still meaning to fix. Yeah, he said. He picked up her tea and drank some of it, which she permitted with a look of mild protest. And outside the garden was grey and wet, and the gnome was doing something inexplicable near the fence. And it was an ordinary Thursday morning in a house that was not yet his. But somewhere in Wiltshire, a kitchen was warm, and a copper beech was holding its summer in the wood, and a table had been right for a very long time. The offer was accepted on a Friday. Thorpe owled them in the morning, a brief professional note in his careful handwriting, the kind that conveyed good news without performing it. The vendors have accepted your offer. Completion can proceed at the earliest mutually agreeable date. Harry read it at the Burrow kitchen table and passed it to Ginny without saying anything, and she read it and set it down carefully on the table, and they looked at each other. Molly, who had been at the counter and was technically not reading the letter, said, "Oh, wonderful," in a voice that was trying very hard to be moderate and was not entirely succeeding. Completion happened 6 weeks later, on a Thursday. Harry had not chosen Thursday deliberately, but when it arrived, he thought it was right. Thorpe handed over the keys with the quiet satisfaction of a man who liked the work of matching people to places. The keys were old iron, large and slightly heavier than modern keys, the kind that fit the locks of a house that had been locking and unlocking itself for nearly 200 years. Harry held them for a moment before putting them in his pocket. They moved nothing in that first week. This was Ginny's idea. She had said, when they were discussing timelines, that she wanted to see the house empty first, before furniture, before boxes, before anything. She wanted to see what it actually was before they started filling it. Harry had thought about this and said yes. They went on a Tuesday evening in March, when the light lasted long enough to still be present at 5:30. The lane was quiet, the iron gate standing open as always, the gravel path curving through the trees. The copper beech had begun. The leaves were just emerging, small, that particular reddish bronze of new copper beech growth, catching the late light and doing something Harry had no word for. He stopped on the path and looked at them. "There it is," Ginny said softly beside him. "Yeah," Harry said. They stood there for a moment. Neither of them moved. The house was cold from standing empty, and Harry lit the Aga first thing. A practical decision, but also something else. Something about the rightness of the first thing in this house being warmth. It took a few minutes to catch properly, and he crouched in front of it in the empty kitchen with the quiet focus of the task. And when the warmth began to come off, he stood and looked around. The kitchen was extraordinary in the evening light. Not the morning pour he'd seen before. Not the long, even fall of the February viewing. This was different. The sun lower now, the angle changed, the light coming through the tall window in a warmer register, the kind of gold that March managed occasionally when it was feeling generous. It lay across the stone floor in a long, slanted shape, reaching further than it had in February, touching the far wall. The kitchen was entirely empty. No table, no chairs, nothing on the counters, the shelves bare. Just the Aga and the stone floor and the extraordinary window and the light. Ginny was standing in the middle of it. She was doing the thing, the arms slightly loose, the breath settling, the face doing what it did when she was simply in a place and choosing it. But it was different from the viewing. Then she had been feeling whether it could be. Now she was feeling that it was. Harry watched her for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen and stood beside her, and the light from the tall window reached them both, and the Aga was beginning to do its warm work, and the house was quiet around them in the way of a house that was waiting, with considerable patience, to be lived in. "We should have brought tea," Harry said. Ginny laughed, a real one, short and easy. "Next time." They walked the house in the evening light, not with the purpose of a viewing, not with Thorpe and his clipboard and his careful professional manner. Just the two of them, moving through the rooms as they were. Bare floors, bare walls, bare shelves, all of it emptied to the essential shape of, looked at them and thought about what looked at them and thought about what would go there, did not stop himself thinking it. The study with its built-in shelves. He stood in the doorway and looked at them, empty now, dusty in the way the Devon shelves had been, but these were better, deeper, the wood older and more serious. He thought about his books, which were currently in boxes in the Burrow spare room. He thought about what it would be to put them on these shelves, to have them here, reachable, arranged in some order that made sense to him. He thought about Hermione, who would have strong opinions about the ordering system. He thought that he would probably not follow her system, and that this was his right as the person whose study it was. His study. He turned the phrase over, felt its weight. They ended up in the sitting room as the light was fading, the south-facing windows going from gold to amber to the soft grey of dusk, the room changing quality by degrees. There was no furniture, so they sat on the floor, backs against the wall beneath the windows. The warm air from the Aga just beginning to reach this far through the house. Ginny had her knees up, her arms resting on them. Harry sat beside her with his legs stretched out on the bare floorboards, looking at the empty room. It was. He looked at it carefully, trying to feel it rather than measure it. A good room. He had thought this on the viewing, had noted it with the part of him that was always noting things. But now, with the light going and the house quiet and no one else here, he felt it differently. It was a room that had held a lot. He could feel the quality of it, the accumulated years, the many evenings that had happened in this space, the particular depth that old rooms had when they had been genuinely lived in. The floorboards had the slight unevenness of boards that had been walked on for generations. The plaster had the almost imperceptible texture of walls that had been repainted many times, each coat adding something. All of that was still here, in the empty room. The empty room was not empty in that sense. It was full of what had happened in it. even with nothing in it. Harry thought about adding to it. The thought arrived differently than it had before, not cautious, not careful, not the tentative reaching of someone expecting to be told they'd assumed too much. It arrived simply, the way true things arrived when you'd stopped arguing with them. "Where's the table going?" he said. Ginny turned her head and looked at him. "The sitting room table," he said. "You said at the Burrow, the first morning when we started looking. You said you wanted to decide where the table goes." She smiled. "The small one." "Under the window," she said. "The east one, in the mornings." Harry looked at the east window. The light would come through it in the mornings. He knew this, had noted it on the second viewing. Morning light, the early kind, the kind that was still finding its angle. "Okay," he said. "And there," Ginny said, pointing at the far wall. "Bookshelves, floor to ceiling. That's a lot of shelves. You've got a lot of books, and we'll get more." Harry looked at the far wall, imagined the shelves, imagined the books on them, not arranged yet, not in any particular order, just present, just there. "There's going to be noise in this room," Ginny said quietly. Harry looked at her. She was looking at the room, at the empty space of it, the bare floors, the fading light. Her expression was the forward-looking one, the one she wore when she was seeing something that wasn't there yet. "What kind of noise?" he said, though he thought he knew. "Loud noise," she said. "Eventually." She paused. "Children are loud." Harry looked at the room. He let the image form, fully this time, without stopping himself. The tea, room with the bookshelves, and the table under the east window, and the morning light. And in it, some morning that hadn't happened yet, noise. The specific noise of a house that was full of people who belonged in it. Laughter that had not yet been laughed, in a room that was waiting for it, with the patience of a room that understood waiting. He felt something in his chest that was unfamiliar enough that he had to sit with it for a moment before he could name it. It was not the absence of fear. It was something that existed alongside the fear, or perhaps just beyond it, reachable if you moved in the right direction. Chosen, he thought, not rescued, not placed, not assigned or inherited or arranged by circumstance. Chosen with his own hands in a house he had walked to on a Thursday morning under a copper beech tree that knew where it was going, even in February. He had never had that before, not once, in 21 years. He looked at the empty room and heard, very faintly, the laughter that hadn't happened yet. "Yeah," he said. Ginny leaned her head against his shoulder. Outside, the last of the March light left the window, and the room went gently dark, and the Aga was warm at the heart of the house, and neither of them moved for a long time.